Content warning. This episode discusses real historical events involving significant loss of life, including the deaths of women and children. We present this story with deep respect for the victims and their descendants. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to this journey through one of the most treacherous acts of betrayal in British history. Hidden for centuries beneath layers of political convenience and collective amnesia. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will shake your understanding of honor, hospitality, and the dark machinery of power in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a massacre that Britain's government tried desperately to erase from memory, where ancient Highland traditions of sacred hospitality collided with cold political calculation, and where 38 innocent people, men, women, and children, were murdered in their sleep by soldiers they had sheltered and fed for nearly 2 weeks. This is not a tale of battlefield glory or honorable combat. This is the story of the Glencoe Massacre of 1692, and the legacy it left is so dark, so stained with blood and broken oaths, that even now, more than 3 centuries later, the very name Glencoe carries the weight of betrayal. It was the year 1692. In England, William III and Mary II sat upon the throne, Protestant monarchs who had displaced the Catholic James II in what history would sanitize as the Glorious Revolution. Across Europe, the 9 Years' War raged, pitting France against a coalition that included England. In the American colonies, Salem was descending into witch trial hysteria, and in the Scottish Highlands, an ancient way of life, clan-based, Gaelic-speaking, and fiercely independent, was being systematically dismantled by a government that viewed it as primitive, dangerous, and inconvenient. The Highlands in 1692 were not merely a geographic region. They were another world entirely, separated from the lowlands not just by mountains and glens but by language, culture, and centuries of distinct history. While Edinburgh embraced Protestant Reformation and English influence, the Highlands clung to older ways. Here, loyalty was to clan and chief, not to distant monarchs. Justice was administered by ancient codes, not parliamentary decree. And hospitality, the sacred duty to shelter and feed any traveler who sought refuge, was considered more binding than any written law. The landscape itself seemed designed for isolation and independence. From the southern reaches near Loch Lomond to the northern extremes of Sutherland, the Highlands were a terrain of impossible beauty and equal danger. Jagged peaks thrust skyward, their summits often lost in swirling mists. Deep glens carved between mountains offered the only passages through this vertical wilderness. In winter, which could arrive as early as October and linger until May, these glens became wind tunnels where blizzards could trap and kill the unprepared within hours. And there, nestled in one of the most dramatic and isolated of these glens, was Glencoe itself. Glencoe, the Glen of Weeping, earned its name honestly. The valley ran roughly east to west for some 10 miles, flanked on both sides by mountains that rose 3,000 feet from the glen floor. To approach from the east was to enter a cathedral of stone, where the peaks of Betrayal et Tivamore stood sentinel like massive guardians determining who would pass. The River Coe wound through the bottom of the glen, its waters running cold and clear from snowmelt and rain, the sound of its passage echoing off the cliff faces above. In winter, which is where our story takes us, Glencoe was a world of monochrome severity. Snow crowned every peak and clung to every ledge. Ice formed in sheets along the waterfalls that cascaded from heights. The sun, when it appeared at all, traced a low arc across the southern sky, never quite reaching into the deepest shadows of the glen. Darkness came early, by 3 in the afternoon, and the night stretched long and brutally cold. The wind that funneled through the valley could strip the warmth from a body in minutes, could turn snow into horizontal needles of ice that stung exposed skin raw. This was the ancestral home of the MacDonalds of Glencoe, a sept of the larger clan Donald that had once ruled the Western Highlands and Islands as Lords of the Isles. By 1692, that power had long since been broken by Scottish kings who feared any subject too mighty to control. But in their glen, the MacDonalds remained, some 500 souls living in small clusters of stone and turf houses, tending their cattle, observing the old ways, speaking Gaelic as they had for 1,000 years. Their chief was Alistair Ruad MacIain, Alistair the Red, so called for his ruddy complexion and the color of his beard. He was, by all accounts, a man of the old Highland mold, tall, physically imposing even in his 60s, proud to the point of arrogance, quick to anger but equally quick to hospitality. His authority over his clan was absolute in the traditional sense. He was judge, war leader, and father to his people. Two of his sons, John and Alistair Ogg, had already distinguished themselves as warriors in the various conflicts that perpetually roiled the Highlands. To understand what happened in Glencoe, you must first understand the political maelstrom that was Scotland in the late 17th century. The deposition of James VII, James II of England in 1688, had fractured Scottish society along existing fault lines. Many Highland clans, Catholic or Episcopalian and loyal to traditional monarchy, supported James and would become known as Jacobites, from Jacobus, Latin for James. Other clans, particularly in the lowlands and among the Campbells, supported William and Mary, the Protestant usurpers. In 1689, John Graham of Claverhouse, Viscount Dundee, had raised the Jacobite standard and led Highland forces to a stunning victory over government troops at Killiecrankie. The MacDonalds of Glencoe fought in that battle. They tasted victory, but Dundee fell with a musket ball through his armor, and without his leadership, the Jacobite cause in Scotland foundered and collapsed. By 1691, the government in Edinburgh, acting on orders from London, was determined to pacify the Highlands permanently. The Secretary of State for Scotland, Sir John Dalrymple, the Master of Stair, became the architect of a plan that would use a mixture of threats and incentives to force the clan chiefs into submission. The instrument chosen was an oath of allegiance. Every Highland chief was ordered to present themselves before a government magistrate and swear loyalty to King William by January 1st, 1692. The deadline was absolute. The threat was explicit. Any clan whose chief failed to swear would face military action, what the orders called letters of fire and sword, essentially a license to destroy them utterly. On the surface, this seemed straightforward. Swear an oath, accept the new order, continue living. But in the Highlands, matters were never so simple. Many chiefs, including MacIain of Glencoe, were technically bound by existing oaths to the exiled James VII. To swear to William without James's permission would make them oath-breakers, a stain on honor worse than death in Highland culture. They needed dispensation from James himself, who was living in exile in France. As autumn turned to winter in 1691, emissaries traveled secretly back and forth between Scotland and the French court. Finally, in December, permission came from James. His loyal chiefs were released from their oaths to him and permitted to swear to William in order to preserve their people. It was a pragmatic decision from a king who had lost his throne but still cared for his most faithful subjects. But now time was critically short. The deadline was January 1st, 1692, less than 3 weeks away when the permission arrived. And in the depths of a Highland winter, travel was treacherous and slow. MacIain of Glencoe, having received James's permission, delayed as long as pride allowed. He was not a man who bent knee easily, even under such circumstances. Finally, on December 31st, New Year's Eve, he set out from Glencoe with a small party to reach Fort William, where he believed the oath could be administered. Here is where the trap began to close. Fort William, a government garrison on the shores of Loch Linnhe, was commanded by Colonel John Hill, an aging soldier who had served in the civil wars of mid-century and who had, by Highland standards, a reputation as a decent and honorable man. When MacIain arrived, already cutting it desperately close to the deadline, he discovered that Colonel Hill could not administer the oath. Only a civil magistrate could do so, and the nearest was Sheriff Colin Campbell of Ardkinglass, whose seat was in Inverary, some 60 miles south through mountains already locked in winter's grip. Colonel Hill, recognizing the urgency and perhaps feeling some sympathy for the old chief, wrote a letter to accompany MacIain to Inverary, explaining the situation and pleading with the sheriff to accept the oath, even though the deadline would certainly pass before MacIain could reach him. The journey from Fort William to Inverary in early January was an ordeal. The trails, one could hardly call them roads, wound through mountain passes where snow lay waist-deep in places. Ice-crusted rivers had to be forded. The wind came off Loch Fyne like a living thing full of malice and teeth. MacIain was 60 years old, making this desperate journey to swear an oath he found humiliating, racing against an arbitrary deadline to save his people from destruction. He reached Inverary on January 2, 1692, one day late. Sheriff Campbell, when he finally appeared, and MacIain had to wait for him, adding further delay, was torn between duty and mercy. The letter from Colonel Hill carried weight. MacIain's obvious distress and the circumstances of his delay seemed legitimate. After what must have been agonizing deliberation, Sheriff Campbell agreed to administer the oath. On January 6th, MacIain of Glencoe swore allegiance to King William III, and the oath was duly recorded and witnessed. MacIain returned to Glencoe in mid-January, exhausted but relieved. He had sworn the oath. His people were safe. The deadline had passed by only a day, and the reasons were documented and reasonable. Surely that would be enough. He could not have known that in Edinburgh and London, men were already drawing up orders for his clan's extermination. The Master of Stair, Sir John Dalrymple, was a man of the New Age, educated, cosmopolitan, influenced by Enlightenment ideals of rational government and efficient administration. He was also, by every standard that history can apply, a man willing to commit mass murder to achieve political ends. Dalrymple had never trusted the Highlanders, viewing them as barbarians whose clan system was incompatible with modern governance. The requirement for the oath was, in part, a test he hoped some would fail, providing legal justification for their destruction. When he learned that MacIain had missed the deadline, even by a single day, even with documented reasons, he saw not a technicality to be waived, but an opportunity to be seized. In a series of letters written throughout January 1692, Dalrymple's intentions became horrifyingly clear. Writing to various military commanders, he spoke of making examples, of striking terror into the Highlands, of extirpating certain clans root and branch. In one letter he wrote, "For a just example of vengeance, I entreat that the thieving tribe in Glencoe may be rooted out in earnest." Note those words. In earnest, not as a formality, not as a display of force, as a thorough, complete annihilation. Another letter was even more chilling. Let it be secret and sudden. The massacre was to be carried out by stealth and surprise, not in open battle where Highland warriors might have a chance to fight. The goal was not to defeat the MacDonalds. It was to murder them. King William III himself signed the orders on January 16, whether he fully understood what he was authorizing wholesale slaughter of a clan that had attempted to comply with his demands, or whether he simply trusted his secretary's judgment remains debated. But his signature was on the document, and royal authority was thereby given to what would follow. The military commander tasked with executing the plan was Major Robert Duncanson, who passed orders to his subordinate, Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon. And here we encounter one of the most tragic ironies of the entire affair. Campbell of Glenlyon was himself a Highlander, a member of Clan Campbell, and a man with personal connections to the MacDonalds of Glencoe. Captain Robert Campbell was 60 years old, the same age as MacIain himself. Once a man of some substance, he had been financially ruined, partly through his own poor management and drinking, partly through the endemic warfare and raiding that characterized Highland life. The MacDonalds of Glencoe had raided Campbell lands in the past, and Campbell of Glenlyon nursed grievances. But he was also a professional soldier, a man who had spent decades in the king's service, and whatever his private feelings, he was bound by military discipline and duty. The orders he received from Major Duncanson were explicit in their treachery. He was to march his command, some 120 soldiers of the Earl of Argyll's regiment of foot, to Glencoe. He was to present himself as being on routine garrison duty, collecting taxes and maintaining order. He was to request quarters for his men, knowing that Highland law and custom absolutely required the MacDonalds to provide shelter and hospitality. He was to wait, to be fed and warmed and treated as a guest. And then, on a signal, before dawn on February 13th, he was to kill every MacDonald under 70 years of age. The plan relied entirely on exploiting the Highland code of hospitality, which was sacred to the point of being religious. Once a host provided shelter and shared salt and hearth with a guest, that guest was under the host's protection, and the host was under an obligation that overrode clan feuds, personal grudges, even warfare. To murder a man under your own roof, or to murder your host while enjoying his hospitality, was considered among the most heinous crimes imaginable. The Gaelic word for it was mirt, Not simple murder, but murder compounded by betrayal of trust. This is what the government was ordering Campbell and his soldiers to commit. On February 1st, 1692, Captain Campbell and his troops arrived in Glencoe. The sound of their approach preceded them, the crunch of boots through snow, the jingle of equipment, the panting of men who had marched through bitter cold. The MacDonalds would have watched from their scattered settlements as the column of red-coated soldiers made their way up the glen, muskets on shoulders, breath steaming in the frigid air. There was no alarm at first. Soldiers moved through the Highlands regularly, especially in winter when they needed shelter. And Campbell of Glenlyon, whatever the history between their clans, was a known figure, not some anonymous enemy. He spoke Gaelic. He understood Highland ways. He greeted MacIain formally and requested quarters for his men while they conducted His Majesty's business in the area. MacIain, fulfilling the sacred duty of a Highland chief, welcomed them. This decision has been second-guessed endlessly by historians, but in the context of the time, he had little choice. To refuse hospitality would be dishonorable and would likely provoke the very military action that swearing the oath was meant to prevent. Better to host them, feed them, and send them on their way. The soldiers were dispersed among the various settlements scattered through Glencoe, some housed in the main village near where MacIain lived, others further down the glen toward Inverriggan and Achnacawn, still others in the remote shieling huts in the upper reaches of the valley. The MacDonalds, though far from wealthy, shared what they had: shelter, peat fires for warmth, oatcakes and salted meat, and most precious of all in that frozen landscape, whiskey to drive back the cold. For 12 days, the soldiers lived among their future victims, 12 days of breaking bread together, of sharing stories by firelight, of playing games with children who had never learned to fear a red coat. Some of the soldiers gambled and drank with the MacDonald men. Others helped with daily tasks, hauling water, feeding livestock, cutting peat. Friendships formed, or at least the appearance of friendships. Captain Campbell himself was quartered in the home of MacIain's younger son, Alistair Ogg. They dined together. They drank together. Campbell, by multiple accounts, was friendly and relaxed, giving no sign of the orders that burned in his dispatch pouch. On the evening of February 12th, and the final evening, he even accepted an invitation to dine with MacIain himself the next day, a man who knew he was going to murder his host. In a few hours, accepted an invitation to dinner the following night. Let that particular species of cold-blooded treachery settle in your mind. But that night, as darkness fell and the temperature plummeted well below freezing, Campbell received the final order from Major Duncanson. The message was clear. You are hereby ordered to fall upon the rebels, the MacDonalds of Glencoe, and put all to the sword under 70. You are to have special care that the old fox and his sons do not escape your hands. The old fox, that was MacIain, the man whose hospitality Campbell had accepted, whose whiskey he had drunk, whose son's home had sheltered him for nearly 2 weeks. Campbell called together his officers and sergeants. He distributed the orders. The attack would commence at 5 in the morning before dawn, when the MacDonalds would be deeply asleep in that vulnerable darkness before first light. They were to move simultaneously against multiple targets throughout the glen, ensuring no one could escape to warn the others. Some of the soldiers, when they learned what they were being ordered to do, reportedly balked. To kill in battle was one thing. To murder people in their sleep, people who had welcomed and fed them, crossed a line that even hardened soldiers found difficult. But military discipline was absolute, and the orders came with royal authority. To refuse meant court-martial and execution for mutiny. As midnight passed and the early hours of February 13th crept toward the killing time, Glencoe lay sleeping under brittle stars. The temperature had dropped so far that breath froze on beards, and every exhalation hung visible in the air for seconds before dissipating. The River Coe was skinned with ice along its edges. In the scattered settlements, peat fires burned low in central hearths, their smoke rising through holes in the turf roofs. Inside, MacDonald families slept under piled plaids and sheepskins, trusting in their guests' honor, never imagining the betrayal being prepared in the darkness outside. 5 o'clock on the morning of February 13th, 1692. No moon. Stars fading as the first hint of dawn approached, but provided no light yet. The glen was a basin of absolute darkness, The mountain's invisible presences sensed more than seen. The signal was given. At McKean's settlement, soldiers moved into position around the chief's home. They knew the layout. They had been guests there for 12 days. They knew where the old man slept. They knew which door led to his bedchamber. The first shots were fired into the house. Not carefully aimed shots intended to kill specific targets, but volleys designed to wake everyone and create chaos and terror. Then the soldiers rushed inside. McKean, startled from sleep, rose from his bed. He was 60 years old, naked, fumbling in darkness to understand what was happening. Why were his guests firing weapons? Was there an attack? Were they defending the settlement? He never had time to understand. 2 soldiers seized him while he was still disoriented, and a third drove a bayonet between his shoulder blades, the blade punching through his back and erupting from his chest in a spray of blood. The old chief fell, his life ending not in the glory of battle, but in bewildered shock at the hands of men he had sheltered. His wife, Lady Glencoe, tried to flee. Soldiers caught her. One ripped the rings from her fingers, tradition says with his teeth when the rings wouldn't come free, leaving her hands bleeding. They stripped her of her clothing and drove her out into the February darkness wearing nothing but her nightdress. Think about that. The temperature was well below freezing. A woman in her 60s, just having witnessed her husband murdered. Thrust out into darkness and snow and wind that could kill within hours. Wearing only thin linen, she survived barely, finding shelter with sympathetic members of the clan. But the trauma, physical and psychological, would kill her within months. While McKean was being murdered, coordinated killings were happening throughout the glen. At Inverriggen, soldiers under a Sergeant Barber bound 9 men of the clan, marched them to a designated killing ground, and shot them one by one. Among them were elderly men and boys barely old enough to be considered warriors. The bodies were left where they fell, their blood staining the snow black in the growing light. At Achnacon, another group of soldiers fell upon the settlement while families slept. 4 men were killed in their beds, or as they tried to flee. In the chaos, a young boy, sources vary on his exact age but agree he was younger than 10, ran toward a soldier pleading for mercy. Perhaps he knew the soldier, had played games with him during the 12 days of false friendship. The soldier cut him down with a bayonet thrust. A child, murdered in cold blood, but the massacre did not go entirely according to plan. The very layout of Glencoe, scattered settlements, rough terrain, darkness, that had made the MacDonalds vulnerable also provided opportunities for escape. The shots fired at McKean's settlement, the screams, the chaos, woke others in the glen. Those who woke quickly enough, who understood immediately what was happening, fled into the night and the mountains. Alistair Ogg, McKean's younger son, whose home had housed Captain Campbell, managed to escape with his family through a back opening as soldiers burst through the front. John MacDonald, the elder son, also escaped the initial assault. Dozens of others, men, women, children, ran into the darkness wearing whatever they had slept in, which often meant very little. This was both salvation and doom. The immediate killing lasted perhaps an hour. When it was over, 38 MacDonalds lay dead by direct violence, shot, bayoneted, beaten to death. 38 people who had violated no law, who had sheltered and fed their murderers, who had died not in battle but in the most dishonorable way imaginable. But the death toll did not end at 38. The plan had called for additional troops to seal the southern end of the glen, trapping the MacDonalds between the hammer of Campbell's men and the anvil of the blocking force. Those troops, marching through terrible weather, had been delayed. They arrived too late. The southern escape route was still open when the survivors fled. But fleeing into a Highland winter without preparation was only slightly less deadly than staying to face the bayonets. Picture what that night and the days that followed were like. Families running through darkness over terrain they knew intimately, but which was now rendered treacherous by ice and snow. Women carrying infants, elderly grandparents trying to keep pace. No food, no warm clothing, no shelter. The temperature remained below freezing for days. Snow fell intermittently, covering tracks but also making travel even more difficult. Those who tried to hide in the mountains, in caves, in shieling huts, in whatever shelter they could find, faced the choice between hypothermia and discovery. Many died of exposure. How many exactly, we will never know. The Highlands in winter were deadly even under the best circumstances. Dozens of McDonald's, possibly more than 100 when you account for the elderly and very young, perished in the snow and cold in the days and weeks following the massacre. They froze to death in caves. They collapsed on mountain trails and were buried by drifts. Mothers died clutching babies who had already stopped breathing. The soldiers, meanwhile, engaged in an orgy of destruction. They burned every building they could reach. The small stone and turf houses went up in flames fueled by peat and heather thatch, sending pillars of smoke into the gray sky. Livestock, cattle, sheep, horses, were rounded up and driven away as plunder or simply killed to deny them to any survivors. Stores of food were destroyed or looted. The goal was not just to kill the McDonald's, but to ensure that any who survived would find nothing to return to, would be unable to rebuild, would be scattered as refugees dependent on the charity of neighboring clans. Captain Campbell and his soldiers departed Glencoe later that day, marching away from the burning settlements with their stolen cattle and plunder. What Campbell thought or felt in those hours is unknown. He left no diary, no memoir expressing regret or justification. He was a soldier who had followed orders. Or perhaps, and this is darker, still, he was a man who had nursed grievances against the McDonald's and found in those orders permission to exact personal revenge under the cover of official duty. We will never fully know. What we do know is that when he left Glencoe, the glen was a charnel house of blood and ashes, and the screams of the dying and bereaved echoed off mountains that had seen violence before but never treachery of this calculated and intimate nature. News of the massacre spread through the Highlands like wildfire, and with it came a wave of horror and rage that transcended clan rivalries. Even clans that had no love for the McDonald's, even those that had fought against them in past feuds, were united in their revulsion at what had been done. The violation of hospitality was the issue that resonated most powerfully. Every Highland chief understood that what had been done to the McDonald's could be done to them. If soldiers could be billeted in your home, accept your food and warmth, and then murder you in your sleep, then the entire social fabric that held Highland society together was meaningless. Trust became impossible. The ancient codes that governed behavior even in times of warfare had been trampled by government order. This was terrorism in its purest form, violence designed not just to punish one group but to instill fear in all others. The survivors of Glencoe, scattered among sympathetic clans, began telling their stories. The details emerged slowly. The 12 days of false friendship. Campbell's acceptance of McKean's dinner invitation hours before murdering him. The children cut down, the elderly stripped and driven into the snow. The systematic destruction of every building and resource. In Edinburgh and London, the government's initial response was denial and obfuscation. Official reports claimed that the McDonald's had been harboring rebels or had refused the oath, neither true. When challenged with evidence that McKean had indeed sworn the oath, only slightly late and with documented reasons, officials fell back on legalistic arguments. The deadline had been absolute. No exceptions could be made. The McDonald's had remained technically in rebellion, and therefore subject to military action. But even in an age when civilian casualties in warfare were common and massacres happened with some regularity, the Glencoe affair stood out for its sheer calculated betrayal. British society in 1692, for all its flaws and violence, still held certain codes of honor, and those codes had been obliterated in the service of political expedience. Pressure mounted for an investigation. Highland chiefs petitioned Parliament. Jacobite propagandists seized on the massacre as proof of William's tyranny. Even lowlanders who had no sympathy for Highland culture or Jacobite politics found themselves disturbed by what had been done. In 1695, 3 years after the massacre, the Scottish Parliament finally convened a commission of inquiry. The inquiry heard testimony from survivors, from soldiers who had participated, from officers who had given orders. What emerged was a documentary trail of premeditated murder. The letters from the Master of Stair were entered into evidence, those chilling documents calling for the McDonald's to be rooted out in earnest, demanding the killings be secret and sudden. The orders from Major Duncanson to Captain Campbell were read aloud in Parliament. You are to put all to the sword under 70. Witnesses described McKean's murder in detail. The old chief rising from bed, confused and vulnerable, bayoneted by men he had sheltered, his wife's rings torn from her bleeding fingers. The 9 men shot at Inverriggen, the child cut down while pleading for mercy. The commission's conclusions were damning. They found that the massacre had been murder under trust, murt in Gaelic law, one of the most heinous crimes conceivable. They found that the government had knowingly and deliberately ordered the violation of hospitality and the killing of people who had attempted to comply with the oath requirement. The commission recommended that those responsible be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Major Duncanson, Captain Campbell, the soldiers who had pulled triggers and thrust bayonets, all should face justice for murder. And above them all, the commission pointed to the Master of Stair, Sir John Dalrymple, whose letters demonstrated beyond any doubt that he had been the principal architect of the massacre. The findings were published. The evidence was irrefutable. Justice, it seemed, would finally be served. And then, nothing. King William, whose signature had authorized the massacre, declined to prosecute anyone. The Master of Stair, though publicly condemned and forced to resign his position, faced no criminal charges. He retired briefly from public life, then returned to government service a few years later, his career ultimately unimpaired by his documented role in mass murder. Major Duncanson was never court-martialed. Captain Campbell of Glenlyon continued serving in the army until his death 5 years later from natural causes. The ordinary soldiers who had actually committed the killings were never identified or charged. Not one person faced justice for the Glencoe Massacre. The reasons for this complete failure of accountability were political. William could not afford to alienate his supporters in Scotland by punishing men who had been following government orders. The Master of Stair, whatever his crimes, remained too well connected and too useful to sacrifice. And the ordinary soldiers? They had been following orders from their superior officers, backed by royal authority. To prosecute them would raise dangerous questions about military discipline and the limits of lawful orders. So the victims were denied justice, the perpetrators walked free, and the message sent to the Highlands was clear. The government could and would destroy you with impunity, and there was no recourse, no appeal, no possibility of holding power accountable for its atrocities. The survivors of the Glencoe MacDonalds slowly rebuilt. Some returned to the glen within months of the massacre, finding their homes destroyed, but their land still there. Others never returned, settling instead among sympathetic clans or emigrating to Ireland and eventually to the American colonies. The clan never regained its former strength or numbers. The trauma, psychological and physical, had been too great, but they endured, and they remembered. To this day, more than 300 years later, there are MacDonalds who will not enter an establishment owned by a Campbell. The feud, frozen at that terrible February moment in 1692, has never formally ended. When asked, they can tell you exactly why. Murder under trust. The landscape of Glencoe itself became a memorial, though not one officially designated. The mountains remained, the three sisters towering over the glen, Betrayal etive Moor standing guard at the eastern entrance, Aonach Igach's knife-edge ridge looming to the north. The river coast still runs cold and clear, but those who know the history cannot walk through the glen without feeling the weight of what happened there. There are cairns marking where bodies were found. Small memorials, some official but many placed by descendants, scattered through the valley. A monument stands in the village, listing the names of the known dead, 38 names, though we know the true count was higher when you include those who died of exposure in the aftermath. The settlement where MacIain was murdered is gone, returned to grass and heather. But in winter, when snow covers the ground and the wind howls down from the peaks, it is not difficult to imagine that February morning. The darkness, the sudden violence, the betrayal of trust. What does the Glencoe Massacre teach us across the span of centuries? First, it reveals the machinery of state-sponsored terrorism. This was not a spontaneous atrocity born of battlefield passion or individual cruelty. It was a calculated policy decision made by government officials, documented in written orders, authorized at the highest levels. The Master of Stair did not act from personal hatred of the MacDonalds. He had never met them, had no personal grievance. He saw them as a problem to be eliminated, an example to be made, a demonstration of power that would cow other Highland clans into submission. This is how genocidal thinking begins, when a government views a population not as citizens or even as enemies worthy of honorable combat, but as problems to be solved through elimination. The MacDonalds were not defeated in battle. They were murdered in their beds. The goal was not military victory, but annihilation as a tool of social engineering. Second, Glencoe demonstrates the particular horror of betrayal killings. The soldiers who carried out the massacre were not strangers attacking from outside. They were guests, hosted and fed for 12 days, who violated the most sacred bonds of human society. This distinction matters. Throughout history, warfare has followed certain rules, however often violated. Enemies face each other in battle. Sieges give opportunities for surrender. But to accept hospitality and then murder, your host transforms killing into something darker, a corruption of the fundamental human bonds that make society possible. The Highland Code of Hospitality was not unique to Scotland. Versions of it exist in cultures worldwide, from the ancient Greek concept of xenia to Bedouin traditions to Pashtun Nanawati. The reason is simple. Hospitality creates trust, and trust makes civilization possible. When that trust can be weaponized, when hospitality becomes a vulnerability to be exploited, society itself begins to disintegrate. Third, the massacre reveals how power escapes accountability. The Commission of Inquiry did its work. The evidence was documented and public. The guilt of the Master of Stair and others was established beyond any reasonable doubt. And yet no one was punished. Justice was sacrificed to political convenience. And that failure of accountability sent a message that echoed far beyond the Highlands. The powerful can order atrocities and face no consequences. This pattern, atrocity, investigation, documented guilt, and then impunity, has repeated throughout history. The Glencoe Massacre stands as an early example of what would become a depressingly familiar sequence. Initial denial, grudging admission, promises of justice, and ultimately, the protection of those responsible because prosecuting them would be politically inconvenient. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Glencoe demonstrates the resilience of memory against official forgetting. The British government tried to bury this story. Official histories glossed over it or justified it. The Master of Stair's letters were archived and forgotten. For decades and centuries, the massacre was treated as a minor incident in a minor place, barely worth mentioning in the grand sweep of British imperial history. But the Highlands remembered. Oral tradition kept the story alive. Songs and poems in Gaelic commemorated the dead. Each generation of MacDonalds told their children what had happened, ensuring the memory survived even when the written record was suppressed or ignored. This is the power of counter-narrative, of communities refusing to let their histories be erased by those who benefit from forgetting. The victims of Glencoe could not achieve justice, but they achieved something perhaps equally important. They ensured that the truth survived. Even now, after centuries of scholarship, questions remain about the Glencoe Massacre that we may never fully answer. Did King William fully understand what he was authorizing when he signed the orders? The documentary evidence suggests he knew it was a punitive expedition, but did he grasp that it would involve murder under trust, the violation of hospitality, the killing of women and children? Or did the Master of Stair present it to him as a standard military operation against rebels? We have William's signature on the fatal document, but we do not have his thoughts. How many soldiers refused to participate? We know some balked at the orders, but military records are silent on specifics. How many men, when ordered to bayonet a child or shoot an elderly man who had fed them the night before, found the moral courage to refuse? And what happened to those who did refuse? Were they punished? Did they desert? Or did military discipline override whatever conscience they possessed? What was the full death toll? The 38 confirmed killed by direct violence are documented, but how many died of exposure in the days and weeks afterward? Estimates range from 40 to more than 100 additional deaths. We will never know precisely, because many who fled into the mountains simply disappeared into the winter landscape. Their bodies never found or recovered months later when snow melted, too decomposed to identify, and perhaps most hauntingly, what did Captain Campbell of Glenlyon think and feel in those final hours? Did he hesitate when ordered to murder his hosts? Did he rationalize it as military duty, or did he embrace it as revenge for past raids? When he accepted MacIain's invitation to dine the next day, knowing he would murder the old chief before dawn, what was going through his mind? Did he feel any shame, any guilt, any human reluctance? He left no record. He spoke to no one about it, at least not in any documents that survived. 5 years later he was dead, taking whatever he felt to an unmarked grave. The Glencoe Massacre did not happen in isolation. It was part of a broader campaign to break Highland power and integrate the region into the British state. That campaign would continue for another half-century, culminating in the catastrophic Jacobite defeat at Culloden in 1746 and the subsequent destruction of Highland culture. After Culloden, the government banned Highland dress, prohibited the speaking of Gaelic, outlawed the clan system, and implemented policies that would lead to the Highland clearances, the forced removal of entire populations from their ancestral lands to make way for sheep farming. The Glencoe Massacre, in retrospect, was an early indication of the methods that would be employed: state violence, cultural suppression, and the systematic destruction of a way of life deemed incompatible with modern governance. This pattern, the violent subjugation of indigenous or culturally distinct populations by centralizing states, was not unique to Scotland. It was happening simultaneously in Ireland, where English colonization was accelerating. It would happen in the American frontier, in Australia, in Africa, wherever expanding empires encountered populations that resisted assimilation. Glencoe was a microcosm of a much larger process, but its particular horror, the intimate betrayal, the murder under trust, makes it stand out even among other atrocities. The Highland clearances displaced hundreds of thousands, but they were accomplished largely through legal mechanisms and economic pressure, however brutal. The massacres following Culloden were committed in the heat of military victory against armed opponents. Glencoe was cold, calculated murder of people who had tried to comply, who had welcomed their killers, who died not in defiance but in betrayal. Return with me now in imagination to Glencoe as it exists today. The glen has changed remarkably little in 3 centuries. There is a road now cutting through the valley floor, carrying tourists and climbers and coaches full of visitors. There are interpretive signs explaining the geography and history. The village has a visitor center where you can watch a video about the massacre and browse exhibits with artifacts and documents. But step away from these modern intrusions. Walk a few hundred yards into the hills, and you are in essentially the same landscape the MacDonalds knew. The mountains have not changed. The River Coe follows the same course. The wind still funnels through the valley with that same bitter edge in winter. The light, when it appears through the perpetual clouds, still strikes the peaks in the same way, illuminating ridges while leaving the deep corries in shadow. And there is something in that landscape, something beyond the documented history, that carries the weight of what happened. Perhaps it is purely psychological. We know the story, so we feel it in the stones and streams. But ask anyone who has spent time alone in Glencoe, especially in winter, especially in the hours before dawn, and many will tell you the same thing. The place feels haunted, not in any supernatural sense necessarily, but haunted by memory, by trauma so profound that it seems to have soaked into the very geology of the glen. On those February mornings when snow covers the ground and the temperature drops well below freezing, when darkness still holds the glen in the hours before dawn, you can stand where MacIain's settlement once was and imagine it all too clearly. The soldiers moving into position, their breath visible in the cold. The sudden eruption of violence, the screams, the blood on snow, the desperate flight into darkness. The mountains absorbed all of it. The River Coe flowed on indifferent. The wind continued its eternal passage through the valley. Nature witnessed the massacre and kept no record except in the memories of those who lived to tell, and in the stones that still mark where bodies fell. Why does this matter now, more than 3 centuries later? Why should a massacre in a remote Scottish glen in 1692 concern anyone living in the 21st century? Because the patterns that led to Glencoe are still very much alive in our world. We still see governments treating inconvenient populations as problems to be eliminated rather than citizens to be served. We still see the powerful escaping accountability for ordering atrocities while subordinates who carry out those orders sometimes face prosecution. We still see official histories that minimize or erase events that reflect poorly on those in power. We still see communities forced to maintain counter-narratives, to insist on truth against official forgetting. The specific context changes. Highland clans are not 21st century political realities, but the underlying dynamics remain depressingly familiar. Glencoe teaches us to recognize those patterns, to understand how atrocities happen, not through the actions of obvious monsters, but through bureaucratic processes, legal technicalities, and the willingness of ordinary people to follow orders that violate fundamental human decency. It teaches us the value of hospitality and trust as civilizational foundations, and the catastrophic consequences when those foundations are cynically exploited. In an age of increasing polarization, when different groups view each other with suspicion and hostility, the lesson of Glencoe is that certain boundaries must never be crossed. We can disagree, even hate each other, but the moment we weaponize trust itself, we begin destroying the basis for any shared society. It teaches us that justice delayed is often justice denied, but that memory can be its own form of resistance. The MacDonalds never got their day in court. The Master of Stair never faced punishment. But the story survived, and that survival is a refutation of power's attempt to control narrative. In researching this episode, I encountered numerous descendants of both the victims and the perpetrators, MacDonalds who still feel the weight of ancestral trauma, and Campbells who grapple with their clan's role in the massacre. One MacDonald descendant in the United States told me she learned the story from her grandmother, who learned it from her grandmother, an unbroken chain of oral tradition spanning 11 generations. She said she had never met a Campbell she could fully trust, and she was only half joking. The memory passed down through the generations retained its emotional power despite the centuries. A Campbell descendant in Scotland spoke of his shame and the complex feelings of inherited guilt, even though he personally had done nothing wrong and his ancestors were only distantly related to Campbell of Glenlyon. He said he had once tried to enter a pub in a MacDonald-dominated area and was told, politely but firmly, that perhaps he should find somewhere else to drink. The past, he said, isn't really past. These stories might seem like holding on to old grievances, refusing to move on, letting history poison the present. But they can also be seen as a refusal to let atrocity be normalized, to let state violence be forgotten, to let the powerful write history in ways that erase their crimes. There is a tension here, between the need to remember and the need to reconcile, between honoring the dead and not being trapped by their deaths. It's a tension that exists in many places where historical trauma remains unresolved, in Rwanda, in the Balkans, in Cambodia, in the countless places where mass violence has left scars that outlive the immediate victims. Glencoe asks us, how do we remember without letting memory become poison? How do we demand justice without perpetuating cycles of revenge? How do we honor the dead without letting their deaths define us? I don't claim to have answers, but the questions themselves are important. In 1992, on the 300th anniversary of the massacre, there was an attempt at reconciliation. The chief of Clan Campbell made a formal apology to the MacDonalds of Glencoe, acknowledging the horror of what had been done and expressing regret. It was a symbolic gesture, but not an empty one. The chief was visibly emotional, and many present found it moving. The MacDonald chief accepted the apology with grace, acknowledging that those present bore no personal guilt for the actions of ancestors centuries dead. There was an attempt in that moment to let some of the old poison drain away, to acknowledge history without being imprisoned by it. But not everyone was satisfied. Some MacDonald descendants felt the apology came far too late and from the wrong source. It was a Campbell apologizing for Campbell actions. But the real architects of the massacre had been government officials, and the British government has never formally apologized. Others felt that no apology could mean anything without acknowledgement of the systematic destruction of Highland culture that continued for decades after Glencoe. The 1992 reconciliation was a step, but it was not, and could not be, a final resolution. Some wounds cut too deep for complete healing. Some memories are too important to be peacefully resolved, because resolving them would mean forgetting, and forgetting would dishonor the dead. The Glencoe Massacre has inspired countless works of literature, poetry, music, and art over the centuries. It appears in the poems of Robert Burns and countless lesser-known Gaelic bards. It features in novels from Sir Walter Scott's era to modern historical fiction. Folk songs preserve the story and melody, ensuring that even those who don't read history books might learn of Glencoe through music. There's something about this particular atrocity, the intimate betrayal, the violation of sacred hospitality, the murder of the old chief in his bed, that resonates powerfully in artistic imagination. It has all the elements of tragedy: honor, betrayal, innocence destroyed, power abused, justice denied. But the artistic legacy is double-edged. On one hand, these works keep the memory alive, ensuring new generations learn the story. On the other hand, they risk romanticizing or sentimentalizing the massacre, turning real suffering into aesthetic experience, allowing audiences to feel moved without being moved to action. This is a danger with all historical atrocity when it becomes subject for art. The risk that horror becomes entertainment, that trauma becomes a plot device, that the dead become characters in stories that ultimately comfort rather than disturb the living. I hope this episode avoids that trap. The goal here is not to entertain you with a thrilling tale of murder and betrayal, though the story certainly contains those elements. The goal is to honor the memory of those who died, to understand the systems and choices that led to their deaths, and to consider what those deaths might teach us about our own world and our own choices. We are approaching the end of this journey through one of Britain's darkest chapters, a story the government tried to bury beneath official silence and the weight of centuries. What should you take away from the story of Glencoe? Remember first the victims. McCain, the old chief, bayoneted in his own home by men he had sheltered. His wife, rings torn from her fingers, dying slowly of trauma and exposure. The 9 men shot at Inverriggen, the child cut down while begging for mercy. The dozens who died of cold in the mountains, bodies never recovered. They were real people, with names and families and lives that mattered, reduced to historical statistics. Remember the nature of the crime, not battlefield casualties but premeditated murder, not fighting enemies but betraying guests, not military necessity but political convenience dressed in legal justification. Remember the failure of justice, how documented guilt escaped all punishment, how power protected itself while victims were denied any recourse, how the systems meant to provide accountability simply didn't. Remember how memory survived despite everything, how oral tradition preserved the truth when official history tried to erase it, how communities refused to forget even when forgetting would have been easier, how that refusal to forget is itself a form of resistance. And remember that the patterns we see at Glencoe, state violence against inconvenient populations, the exploitation of trust as a weapon, the escape of the powerful from accountability, the attempt to control narrative and suppress uncomfortable truths, are not safely confined to 1692. They are recurring features of how power operates, visible in our own time if we're willing to look honestly at the world around us. On February 13th each year, people gather in Glencoe to remember. It's a small ceremony, nothing official or grand, just descendants and historians, and those who feel the story matters. They lay wreaths at the memorial cairn. Sometimes a piper plays a lament. Words are spoken in Gaelic and English. Names are read: McCain, John MacDonald, Alastair Og MacDonald, the known dead and the unknown, and then they stand in silence for a time, while the wind moves through the glen and the river Coe murmurs. Over stones and the mountains loom, unchanged since that frozen February morning 333 years ago. There's a Gaelic phrase sometimes invoked at these ceremonies. Gún Diolchim Hennig Singubrath. We will never forget, not as a threat, not as a vow of revenge, but as a promise to the dead that they will not be erased, that their suffering will not be minimized or forgotten, that the truth of what happened to them will survive. That promise has been kept for more than 3 centuries. As long as people gather in Glencoe each February, as long as the story is told, as long as we refuse to let atrocity be normalized or dismissed, that promise continues to be kept. Visit Glencoe in winter if you can. Stand where the old settlement was in the hour before dawn, when darkness still holds the valley and the cold seeps through every layer of clothing. Wait for the light. As dawn approaches, the mountains begin to emerge from darkness. Shapes first, then details, then the full terrible grandeur of the glen revealing itself. The peaks catch the first light while the valley floor remains in shadow, just as it did on that February morning in 1692. Listen to the silence. It's not complete silence. There's always the wind, the river, perhaps a raven's call echoing off stone. But it's the silence of a place that holds memory, that has absorbed trauma and refuses to release it easily. Stand there and think about what it means to welcome strangers into your home. Think about the bonds of trust that make civilization possible, and what happens when those bonds are cynically exploited. Think about power and accountability, about memory and forgetting, about justice delayed and denied. Think about 38 people murdered in their sleep by men they had fed and sheltered, and the countless others who died fleeing into winter's killing cold, and the survivors who rebuilt and remembered and passed their story down through the generations, ensuring that we, here, now, more than 3 centuries distant, still know their names and honor their deaths. And when you leave Glencoe, whether physically if you visit, or mentally as this episode ends, carry that knowledge with you. Let it inform how you think about power and its abuses, about the importance of accountability, about the value of memory against official forgetting. The dead of Glencoe cannot speak for themselves. They cannot demand justice or tell their own stories. That burden falls to us, to remember them, to understand how they died, to refuse to let their murders be sanitized or forgotten. This is what we owe them. This is what we owe all victims of state violence, of power abused, of systems that protect the guilty and abandon the innocent. Memory, truth, refusal to forget. Gun dio chwimnich singu brath. The story of the Glencoe Massacre remains a disturbing reminder that governments can and do commit atrocities against their own people, that justice is not automatic or inevitable, and that without vigilance and accountability, power will inevitably protect itself at the expense of those it should serve. But questions remain. Why has the British government never formally apologized for Glencoe? Why do so many British history curricula barely mention the massacre? What other stories of state violence have been quietly buried beneath official narratives? And what does it mean that we can document guilt completely and still see no justice delivered? To this day, on cold February mornings in Glencoe, people report hearing sounds carried on the wind, sounds that might be water over stones or wind through narrow passes, or might be echoes of screams from that terrible dawn. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, Glencoe is haunted by memory, by unresolved trauma, by truths that refuse to stay buried. If this journey through betrayal and blood in the Scottish Highlands has resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering how we balance memory with reconciliation, justice with mercy, truth with peace, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be examined, stories of forgotten atrocities, suppressed histories, and dark truths that power would prefer remain buried. Leave a like if this account has provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, if it has made you think differently about how history is remembered and forgotten, about how power operates and escapes accountability. And comment with your thoughts. Should old grievances ever be forgiven? Or does forgiveness require justice first? How do we honor historical victims without being trapped by their suffering? What other massacres and atrocities have been conveniently forgotten by official histories? The conversation continues beyond this episode. History is not fixed or settled. It's constantly being reinterpreted, rediscovered, and sometimes deliberately obscured. Every time we examine a story like Glencoe, every time we insist on truth despite official narratives, we participate in that ongoing struggle over how the past is understood and what lessons it offers the present. Until next time, remember that the darkest chapters of history are not always the ones written about in textbooks or commemorated with monuments. Sometimes they're hidden in remote glens, preserved in oral tradition, waiting for someone willing to listen and tell the story that power wanted forgotten. The mountains of Glencoe stand unchanged. The river Coe flows as it has for millennia, and on February mornings when snow covers the ground and the wind howls down from the peaks, the glen remembers what was done there, even if official history tried to forget. The dead of Glencoe rest in unmarked graves, scattered throughout the valley they called home. But their story lives on, passed from generation to generation, surviving every attempt to suppress or sanitize it. They were murdered, but they were not erased. Their killers escaped earthly justice, but they did not escape judgment. The government tried to bury this story, but it could not bury the truth. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson Glencoe teaches us, that memory is stronger than power, that truth outlives those who try to suppress it, and that some betrayals are so profound that even 3 centuries cannot wash away the stain. Gun dio chwimnich singu brath. We will never forget. To fully understand why Glencoe happened, why the government was so determined to make a brutal example, why the Highlands were viewed with such suspicion and hostility, we must step back and examine the larger conflict that provided the context for the massacre. The Jacobite cause did not begin or end with Glencoe. It was a movement that would convulse Scotland and England for more than half a century, leading to battles, executions, and the ultimate destruction of an entire way of life. Glencoe was an early chapter in this story, a demonstration of the methods that would be employed again and again until Highland resistance was finally crushed at Culloden in 1746. The roots of Jacobitism lay in religion and legitimacy. When James VII of Scotland, James II of England, was deposed in 1688, he was replaced by his daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange in what was termed the Glorious Revolution, glorious at least to those who supported it. But to others, particularly Catholics and many Episcopalians, it was nothing less than an illegal coup d'etat, a violation of the divine right of kings, and a triumph of Protestant extremism over legitimate monarchy. James had been an unpopular king, no question. His attempts to grant religious tolerance to Catholics had alarmed the Protestant establishment. His autocratic tendencies and French sympathies had made him many enemies. But unpopular or not, he was the legitimate king by every law of succession. His replacement by William, invited to invade England by a cabal of nobles, set a dangerous precedent. That Parliament could depose an anointed monarch and choose his replacement based on religious and political preferences. Many Highlanders, particularly those in clans like the MacDonalds, viewed this as fundamentally wrong. Their loyalty was to the Stuart line, to traditional monarchy, to an older order that preceded parliamentary supremacy. When John Graham of Claverhouse, Viscount Dundee, raised the Jacobite standard at Dundee Law in April 1689, thousands of Highlanders flocked to his banner. The Battle of Killiecrankie, fought on July 27, 1689, was their moment of glory. In a steep-sided pass in Perthshire, Dundee led a Highland charge against government forces that shattered the enemy line and sent them fleeing in panic. The Highland warriors fought in their traditional manner, a devastating downhill rush with broadswords and target shields, a tactic that could break disciplined infantry through sheer ferocity and momentum. But victory turned to ashes in Dundee's mouth. At the moment of triumph, a musket ball struck him in the chest, penetrating his breastplate through a gap in the armor. He died on the battlefield, and with him died any real hope of Jacobite success in that rising. The Highland army, without his leadership, fragmented. Attempts to continue the campaign faltered. By winter, the rising had effectively collapsed. The MacDonalds of Glencoe had been there. They had charged at Killiecrankie. They had tasted victory. They had seen what Highland warriors could do against regular troops when circumstances favored them. And then they had watched it all come to nothing. This history hung over the oath-taking requirement of 1691. The government knew these men had fought against them, had killed crown soldiers, had supported a rebellion against William's authority. The oath was meant to humiliate them, to force them to publicly acknowledge William's kingship and renounce their Jacobite sympathies. For proud men like MacIain, taking such an oath was bitter gall, but they took it anyway, because they understood that times had changed, that the cause was lost for now, that protecting their people meant swallowing pride. MacIain's desperate journey through winter snow to swear the oath was an act of pragmatism, even as it felt like betrayal of everything he believed in, and the government murdered him for it anyway. Let us return to the men who ordered and carried out the massacre, and try to understand, not excuse but understand, what led them to commit such an atrocity. The Master of Stair. Sir John Dalrymple was not a sadist or a psychopath in any clinical sense. By the standards of his class and time, he was a learned, cultured man. He had studied law and philosophy. He corresponded with intellectuals across Europe. He believed genuinely that he was working toward a more rational, orderly Scotland, one governed by law and enlightened administration rather than by the chaotic feudal bonds of clan loyalty. In his mind, the Highland clans represented everything backward and barbaric. They spoke a language he considered primitive. They followed chiefs rather than laws. They engaged in endemic cattle raiding and feuding that made economic development impossible. They had supported rebellion against the legitimate, in his view, government. They were, in essence, obstacles to progress that needed to be removed. This is a familiar pattern in history: the reformer who becomes a monster, the progressive who justifies atrocity in the name of improvement, the civilizer who destroys the peoples he claims to be helping. Dalrymple saw himself as a servant of order and reason. The MacDonalds were, to him, a problem requiring a solution. That the solution involved mass murder did not seem to trouble him particularly, because in his calculus, they were not quite fully human in the way he and his peers were. They were primitives, throwbacks, obstacles. Read his letters again with this understanding. For a just example of vengeance, I entreat that the thieving tribe in Glencoe may be rooted out in earnest. Note that phrase, thieving tribe, not a clan, not a people, but a tribe, a word chosen deliberately to dehumanize, to place them outside the circle of those deserving of normal human consideration, and rooted out, the language of weeding gardens, of removing pests, not of dealing with fellow citizens. This bureaucratic dehumanization made the massacre possible. Dalrymple never saw the faces of those who would die. He never heard the screams. He never had to explain to a child why soldiers who had eaten at their table were now trying to kill them. He wrote orders on paper, sealed them with wax, sent them off, and returned to his other administrative duties. Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon presents a different psychological profile. He was no distant bureaucrat, but a man who would have to look his victims in the face, who would have to sleep under their roofs and eat their food while knowing what was coming. What goes through a man's mind in such circumstances? Campbell was a career soldier, conditioned to follow orders. Military discipline in the 17th century was absolute and brutal. Disobedience meant flogging, court-martial, execution. When a superior officer handed down orders bearing royal authority, a captain did not have the luxury of moral deliberation. Or so the reasoning went. But he was also a Highlander himself, a man who understood the sacred nature of hospitality, who knew that what he was being ordered to do violated every code he had been raised with. The oath of hospitality was not merely a social custom, but something approaching a religious obligation in Highland culture. To violate it was to damn oneself. Did Campbell rationalize it as military necessity? Did he tell himself that orders were orders? That he had no choice? That the responsibility lay with those who commanded him, rather than with those who carried out the commands? This is what men have told themselves throughout history when ordered to commit atrocities. I was just following orders. I had no choice. If I refused, they would have found someone else to do it, or did darker motivations play a role? Campbell had been ruined financially, partly through his own drinking and poor management, but also partly through the endemic raiding and feuding of Highland life. MacDonald's had raided Campbell lands. There were old grudges, old scores. Did the orders give him permission to act on personal vengeance under the cover of military duty? We will never know. Campbell left no memoir, no confession, no explanation. He carried out the orders, collected his stolen cattle, and marched away. 5 years later, he was dead, and whatever he felt or thought died with him. The 1695 Commission of Inquiry heard testimony from dozens of survivors. Their accounts, preserved in the official records, provide the most detailed picture we have of what that night was like for those who lived through it. One witness, a young man named Duncan McRanald, described the hours before the attack. All was peaceful. The soldiers had been quartered among us for 12 days. They had eaten at our tables, played with our children, helped with our work. There was no sign of what would come. Captain Campbell himself seemed at ease, joking and drinking. When we went to sleep that night, we thought them our guests, under our protection and we under theirs according to the old ways. He continued, I was wakened by shots. At first I thought perhaps there was a raid, that the soldiers were defending us. Then I heard screaming. I looked out and saw soldiers shooting into houses, bayoneting anyone who tried to flee. I grabbed my younger sister and ran. We had only our nightclothes. The cold was terrible, but the terror was worse. We ran into the darkness, not knowing where we were going, only that we had to get away. Another survivor, an elderly woman named Sarah MacDonald, testified about what happened to Lady Glencoe. I saw her after they drove her from her house. She was wearing only her shift, and her hands were bleeding where they had torn the rings from her fingers. She was shaking uncontrollably from cold and shock. We wrapped her in plaids and tried to warm her, but she was never the same after that night. The life had gone out of her. She lasted some months more, but she was dead from that moment, really. They killed her as surely as they killed her husband, only slower. The testimony about the children was particularly harrowing. Multiple witnesses described how soldiers had been seen playing with MacDonald children in the days before the massacre, teaching them games, giving them small treats, carrying the youngest ones on their shoulders. And then those same soldiers participated in the killing. One witness recounted, "I saw a soldier. I knew his face. He had been kind to my nephew, had carved him a small wooden sword. I saw this same soldier cut down a boy who was running toward him. The boy was crying. He was scared. He ran to the soldier thinking he would be protected, and the soldier killed him. I cannot forget that. I will never forget it. How does a man do such a thing?" This is perhaps the deepest horror of Glencoe. Not just that people were killed, but that the bonds of human connection were weaponized and then destroyed. The soldiers had formed relationships with their victims, superficial perhaps, but real in the moment. They had been thanked for their help, had shared meals, had seen these people as human beings with names and personalities and lives, and then, when ordered, they killed them anyway. This suggests something profound and terrible about human nature, that we are capable of compartmentalizing to an extraordinary degree, that we can hold contradictory realities in our minds simultaneously, that orders from authority can override even direct personal experience of someone's humanity. The 38 people killed by direct violence were not the end of the death toll. The survivors who fled into the mountains faced conditions that were, in many cases, a slower death sentence. Try to imagine it. You are awakened by gunfire and screaming. You see soldiers, men who have shared your food, killing your neighbors, your family. You grab whoever is nearest, a child, an elderly parent, a spouse, and you run into the February darkness wearing whatever you slept in. The temperature is well below freezing. Snow covers the ground. The wind is a physical force, stripping warmth from your body with every gust. You are in night clothes, perhaps barefoot, perhaps with a plaid thrown over you if you are lucky, but nothing approaching adequate clothing for these conditions. Where do you go? Into the mountains, away from the soldiers, but the mountains in winter are nearly as deadly as the bayonets. You are looking for shelter, a cave, a shieling hut, an overhang that might protect you from the wind. You are looking for anything that might help you survive until dawn, until you can see where you are and where you might find help. But dawn brings little relief. The killing continues through the morning as soldiers search for those who fled. Even after they leave, you cannot return to the glen. Your homes are burning. The soldiers might return. There is nothing left. You must travel to find shelter among other clans, and that means crossing mountain passes in winter. Some made it. Duncan McRanald and his sister, despite wearing only night clothes, managed to reach Campbell territory, ironically, where sympathetic Campbells, horrified by what their clansmen had done, provided shelter. Others reached MacDonald kinsmen in neighboring glens. The young and strong had the best chance, if they knew the terrain and had some degree of clothing and luck. But the elderly had almost no chance. Hypothermia sets in quickly at those temperatures, especially for those already weakened by age or illness. The body's core temperature drops. Confusion sets in. The desire to sleep becomes overwhelming. You lie down in the snow, and within hours you are dead, just another shape under a drift that will not be found until the spring thaw. Infants and small children were particularly vulnerable. Their small bodies lost heat rapidly. Mothers held them close, trying to share warmth, but in many cases it was not enough. Testimony from survivors includes heartbreaking accounts of mothers arriving at distant settlements carrying children who had died during the night, frozen against their mother's breast despite every effort to keep them warm. One account tells of a woman who fled with her infant and 2 other small children. By dawn, only she and 1 child were still alive. She had to make the terrible choice to leave the bodies of her other children in the snow and keep moving with the survivor, because to stop meant death for both of them. She made it to shelter, but the guilt and grief destroyed her. She was never right again, witnesses said. These are the deaths that are not in the official count. No one knows exactly how many died this way. Estimates range from 40 to over 100 additional deaths beyond the 38 killed directly. Bodies were found for months afterward as the snow melted, in caves, in shieling huts, on mountain passes, beside streams where people had collapsed while trying to reach water. The Commission of Inquiry of 1695 was thorough in its investigation, but its findings were politically inconvenient. The government faced a dilemma: how to acknowledge the horror of what had been done without undermining its own authority or admitting that it had ordered mass murder. The solution was a masterpiece of political maneuvering. The Commission's report was published, the evidence was made public, the guilt of the Master of Stair and others was documented. but the actual prosecution of anyone involved was quietly sabotaged. The Master of Stair was forced to resign his position, but this was presented as a voluntary retirement rather than a dismissal in disgrace. He withdrew from public life for a few years, during which time he continued to receive his government pension and maintained his estates. In 1700, just 5 years after the inquiry, he was back in government service, serving in various administrative roles. His documented role in ordering a massacre had not permanently damaged his career. King William's role was carefully obscured. Yes, his signature was on the orders, but could not a king be misled by evil counselors? The narrative was constructed to place blame on Dalrymple, while suggesting that William had not fully understood what he was authorizing. This allowed the king to express regret for what had happened while escaping personal responsibility. This pattern, acknowledging atrocity while protecting those responsible, is familiar in the annals of power. Investigations happen, reports are written, guilt is established, and then somehow mysteriously, no one is actually punished. The process itself becomes a substitute for justice, the appearance of accountability replacing actual accountability. The MacDonalds petitioned for compensation for their losses, homes burned, cattle stolen, lives destroyed. The petitions were acknowledged, filed, and then ignored. No compensation was ever paid. The survivors were left to rebuild with their own resources, dependent on the charity of sympathetic clans. Meanwhile, Captain Campbell of Glenlyon continued his military career. He faced no court-martial. His command was not taken away. He served in various garrisons until his death in 1696. The ordinary soldiers who had carried out the killings were never identified or questioned. Military discipline and the shield of following orders protected them all. This complete failure of justice did not go unnoticed in the Highlands. The message was clear. The government could order your murder, your killers would face no consequences, and you would have no recourse. This realization hardened resistance in many clans, confirming their worst suspicions about the Williamite regime. Paradoxically, the massacre that was supposed to terrify the Highlands into submission actually strengthened Jacobite sentiment. Glencoe became a symbol of government treachery, a rallying cry for those who opposed the new order. When the next Jacobite rising came in 1715, many Highlanders who might have stayed neutral instead took up arms, motivated partly by the memory of Glencoe and what it represented about how the government treated Highlanders. Glencoe was a harbinger of what was to come. Over the next half-century, the British government would systematically destroy Highland culture and society in a campaign that would make Glencoe look like a relatively minor incident by comparison. The Disarming Acts, passed repeatedly between 1716 and 1748, attempted to confiscate all weapons from Highland clans. These were only partially successful. Highlanders were adept at hiding weapons and evading searches, but they established the principle that the government could strip entire populations of the means to defend themselves. After the Jacobite defeat at Culloden in 1746, the campaign intensified dramatically. The Act of Prescription 1746 banned Highland dress, the tartan, the plaid, the kilt, on penalty of imprisonment or transportation. For 6 months for the first offense, 7 years for the second. The language was explicit. Wearing Highland dress was illegal, and those caught would be imprisoned without bail until prosecution. Think about what this means. The government was criminalizing cultural identity itself, making it illegal to dress in the clothing your ancestors had worn for centuries. This was cultural genocide by law, an attempt to erase Highland identity by making its visible symbols criminal. The ban lasted for 37 years, an entire generation, during which young Highlanders grew up never having legally worn their traditional dress, never having seen their fathers or grandfathers in the clothing that had marked them as Highland men. When the ban was finally lifted in 1782, much of the traditional knowledge of how to make and wear Highland dress had been lost. Simultaneously, the government banned the teaching of Gaelic in schools. Children were punished for speaking their native language, forced to learn English as the only acceptable tongue. The goal was explicit assimilation, to make Highlanders into lowlanders, to erase the linguistic distinction that marked them as different. The clan system itself was dismantled. The Heritable Jurisdictions Act of 1746 abolished the legal powers of chiefs, who had previously acted as judges and administrators in their territories. Chiefs became landlords rather than patriarchs. Their relationship to their people transformed from one of mutual obligation to one of purely economic transactions. This transformation set the stage for the Highland clearances, which would devastate the region in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Once chiefs were merely landlords concerned with profit rather than patriarchs responsible for their people, it became economically rational to clear tenants from the land and replace them with more profitable sheep farming. Entire communities were evicted, their homes burned to prevent their return, families forced to emigrate to Canada, Australia, or the industrial cities of the lowlands. Hundreds of thousands of Highlanders were displaced over several decades in what amounted to ethnic cleansing by economic means. The landscape of the Highlands today, sparsely populated, dotted with ruined settlements, vast tracts given over to sheep and deer, is the legacy of this systematic destruction. Where once there were thriving communities, Gaelic-speaking villages, a distinct culture with its own customs and laws, there are now emptiness and ruins. Glencoe was the opening move in this campaign. It demonstrated that the government was willing to use extreme violence against Highland populations. The subsequent policies, cultural suppression, forced assimilation, economic clearance, were in some ways more effective precisely because they were less immediately violent. They destroyed Highland culture slowly, legally, making resistance difficult because there was no clear enemy to fight, just the grinding pressure of laws and economic forces. The story of Glencoe occupies a particular place in Scottish historical memory and national identity. It has become, for many Scots, a symbol of English or British government oppression, of the ruthless suppression of Scottish autonomy and culture. This symbolism is somewhat complicated. After all, many of those who carried out the massacre were themselves Scots. Campbell of Glenlyon was as Scottish as MacIain. The orders came from Edinburgh as much as from London. This was not simply English oppression of Scotland, but a more complex story of lowland versus highland, Protestant versus Catholic and Episcopalian, modernity versus tradition, centralized authority versus local autonomy. But in popular memory, these complications have tended to fade, leaving a simpler narrative. Innocent Highlanders betrayed and murdered by government forces, Highland culture suppressed by British imperialism. This narrative has resonated particularly strongly during periods of Scottish nationalist sentiment, when Glencoe has been invoked as evidence of Scotland's historical victimization by the union with England. The massacre has been commemorated in countless ways over the centuries. Robert Burns, Scotland's national poet, referenced it in his work. Victorian writers like Sir Walter Scott included it in novels and poetry, though often romanticizing it in ways that obscured the political realities. In the 20th century, it became a standard part of Scottish history curricula, though how it was taught varied greatly depending on the politics of the time and place. The landscape itself has become a memorial. The Glen attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, many drawn specifically by knowledge of the massacre. They walk the trails where MacDonalds fled. They photograph the mountains that witnessed the killing. They visit the memorials and interpretation centers that tell the story. There is something both appropriate and troubling about this. Appropriate because the victims deserve to be remembered, because the story should not be forgotten. Troubling because there is always a risk that historical trauma becomes tourist attraction, that suffering becomes scenery, that the commerce of heritage tourism commodifies and trivializes real pain. Stand in the Glencoe Visitor Center gift shop and you can buy postcards of the mountains, books about the massacre, tartan scarves and whiskey and shortbread. This is the inevitable result of heritage tourism, but it creates cognitive dissonance. How do you honor victims of an atrocity while simultaneously selling them as a travel experience? The descendants of the victims have complex feelings about this. Some appreciate that the story is being told, that visitors are learning about what happened, that Glencoe remains in public consciousness. Others feel that their ancestors' suffering has been turned into entertainment, that the sacred has been profaned by commercialization. There is no easy resolution to this tension. Memory must be preserved, but preservation requires resources, which requires tourism, which requires commercial development. The alternative, letting the story fade into obscurity, is worse, but the current situation is far from ideal. As we reach the true end of this journey through Glencoe, certain truths crystallize from the accumulated weight of evidence and narrative. The first truth is this: Atrocities happen not because monsters walk among us, but because ordinary people, under certain conditions, are capable of monstrous acts. The soldiers who killed at Glencoe were not demons. They were men, some young, some old, some probably decent in their normal lives, who were placed in circumstances where they followed orders that violated every principle of humanity and honor. This is perhaps the most disturbing lesson, that we cannot comfort ourselves with the belief that only obviously evil people commit atrocities. The capacity for evil exists within the normal range of human psychology, activated by circumstances, authority, propaganda, and the erosion of moral boundaries. The second truth: power protects itself through layers of deniability and procedural complexity. The Master of Stair wrote the orders, but the king signed them. Campbell commanded the operation, but he was following orders from Duncanson. The soldiers pulled triggers and thrust bayonets, but they were following military discipline. Everyone involved could point to someone above or beside them and say, "I was not ultimately responsible." This diffusion of responsibility is how atrocities happen in modern bureaucratic states. No single person feels fully culpable because responsibility is dispersed through hierarchies and procedures. The result is that terrible things are done by systems rather than individuals, and prosecuting systems is far more difficult than prosecuting people. The third truth: justice is not automatic or inevitable, but must be fought for constantly, and even then may not be achieved. The victims of Glencoe had a smoking gun, documentary evidence, eyewitness testimony, official investigations that confirmed their claims. And they still received no justice. The powerful walked free. The perpetrators escaped punishment. This is not an aberration, but a pattern that repeats throughout history. Power has resources, lawyers, influence, control of institutions that victims lack. The struggle for accountability is always uphill, and victories are rare. The fourth truth: memory is resistance. The MacDonalds could not achieve justice, but they could remember. They could tell their story. They could ensure that the next generation knew what had been done, and the generation after that, and after that. Until 3 centuries later, we still know the names of the victims and the details of how they died. This refusal to forget is itself a form of power, weaker than guns or laws, but more enduring. Governments can suppress immediate resistance, can defeat armies, can pass laws, but they cannot ultimately control memory. Stories survive in oral tradition, in songs, in the collective consciousness of communities. Truth has a persistence that power cannot entirely erase. The fifth truth: betrayal of trust is a unique category of evil. Combat between enemies follows certain rules, however brutal. But to accept hospitality and then murder your host, to weaponize the bonds of human connection, to exploit trust as a vulnerability, this is a deeper violation than straightforward violence. It corrodes the foundations of society itself, makes all human interaction suspect, destroys the possibility of peaceful coexistence. The Glencoe Massacre was not just 38 murders. It was an attack on the very concept of hospitality, on the sacred bonds that make civilization possible. This is why, more than 3 centuries later, it still has the power to shock and disturb. So what does Glencoe mean for us here, now, in the 21st century? It means that we must be vigilant against the dehumanization of others, because dehumanization is always the precursor to atrocity. When the Master of Stair called the MacDonalds a thieving tribe that should be rooted out, he was using language designed to place them outside the circle of human concern. This language made the massacre thinkable, justifiable, even necessary in his mind. We see this same language pattern today, applied to different groups in different contexts. Whenever you hear rhetoric that portrays entire populations as pests, as problems, as less than fully human, recognize what is happening. That is the language that precedes violence. That is how ordinary people are prepared to commit or permit extraordinary cruelty. It means that we must reject the excuse of following orders as a shield against moral responsibility. The soldiers at Glencoe had orders, backed by royal authority, delivered through proper military channels. And those orders required them to commit murder. Some obeyed. We do not know if any refused, but we know that refusal was possible. Even if dangerous, each of us in our own contexts faces smaller versions of this choice. Whether to go along with things we know are wrong because authority demands it, because everyone else is doing it, because resistance seems futile or costly. Glencoe reminds us that following orders does not absolve us of moral responsibility for our actions. It means that we must fight for accountability even when that fight seems hopeless. The MacDonalds petitioned for justice and were denied. But their petitioning mattered. It created a historical record. It established that they refused to accept their victimization as legitimate. It inspired others to question government actions. Even when justice is denied, the struggle for it has value. It establishes moral clarity. It creates precedents. It provides inspiration for future struggles. The MacDonalds' fight for justice failed in 1695, but it succeeded across the centuries in ensuring we remember them as victims of injustice rather than as casualties of legitimate military action. Most fundamentally, Glencoe teaches us that how we treat the most vulnerable, the most different, the most inconvenient members of society reveals our true character. The MacDonalds were vulnerable, isolated in their glen, militarily weak after Killiecrankie's failure, politically marginalized. They were different, Gaelic-speaking, clan-based, following traditions that seemed archaic to lowland administrators. They were inconvenient, a reminder that not all of Scotland had accepted the new order, a potential source of future resistance. So they were massacred. The same logic has justified countless atrocities throughout history. The vulnerable are eliminated because they cannot effectively resist. The different are eliminated because they do not fit the preferred model of society. The inconvenient are eliminated because it is easier than accommodating them. A just society, a truly civilized society, is measured not by how it treats the powerful and conformist, but by how it treats those who are weak, different, and difficult. By that measure, the Britain of 1692 failed catastrophically. And by that measure, we must constantly examine our own societies, our own times, asking who is being marginalized, who is being dehumanized, who is being defined as a problem to be solved rather than as human beings deserving of dignity and justice. The mountains of Glencoe have watched civilizations rise and fall. They witnessed the Ice Age glaciers that carved the valley. They watched Pictish peoples leave their marks on stones. They saw Gaelic-speaking clans establish their territories. They witnessed the massacre of 1692. They watched the clearances depopulate the Highlands. They observed the tourists who now walk trails and take photographs. The mountains do not judge. They simply endure. But we, who are human and mortal, do not have the luxury of detached observation. We must judge. We must take sides. We must decide what the story of Glencoe means and what demands it makes upon us. I believe it demands that we remember. Not just as historical knowledge, but as active resistance against the forces that want us to forget, to move on, to accept that atrocities are unfortunate but inevitable features of history that should not trouble us too much. I believe it demands that we recognize the patterns that led to Glencoe: dehumanization, bureaucratic evil, the protection of the powerful, the exploitation of trust whenever they appear in our own time, and that we name them and oppose them. I believe it demands that we honor the victims not with pity, but with commitment. Commitment to justice, to truth, to the defense of the vulnerable, to the preservation of memory against official forgetting. The dead of Glencoe cannot speak for themselves anymore. They have been silent for more than 3 centuries. But their story speaks, if we listen. It tells us that betrayal of trust is one of the deepest evils. That power without accountability becomes tyrannical. That cultural difference is not a problem requiring elimination. That hospitality is sacred. That memory is powerful. That justice, even when denied, remains the standard by which we must judge our actions and our societies. These mountains, these stones, this river flowing cold and clear through the glen, they witnessed what happened on that February morning in 1692. They cannot forget, and neither should we. Gundio Huimnich sin gubrath. We will never forget, not because we cling to ancient grievances, but because forgetting would dishonor the dead and make it easier for such atrocities to happen again. The story of Glencoe ends not with comfort or resolution, but with challenge. What will you do with this knowledge? How will it change how you see power and its abuses? How will it inform your choices when you face, in whatever small or large ways, decisions about whether to follow orders, whether to look away from injustice, whether to remember or forget? These are the questions Glencoe poses to every generation. The mountains wait for our answers.